Welcome to the Cinematologists podcast. I'm Dario Linares, and down the line for the second part of our end-of-year review, it's Neil Fox. Hello, Neil.
Hello, Dario. Hello, listeners. It's lovely to be back after a short coffee break to record the second part of this end-of-year special. Thanks to our Patreons for suggesting we do 10. And if you want to hear 6 to 10, you can head on over to the Patreon and sign up, where you can hear us talking about a whole heap of films that we're not going to talk about on this episode, but we are going to talk about 10, 5 each, doing our 5 to 1, which is really lovely, actually. It's been nice already to be back in this space for such a prolonged period, thinking about the year in cinema as we have experienced it. What about you?
Yeah, no, it's been great, and just to add on the Patreons, we sort of talk about the year in cinema and what kind of a year it's been for us anyway, and just to sort of reiterate the themes. I think, Neil, you were talking about the sort of coherence of your list was very much around film form, and mine was more around the kind of context of watching.
Yeah.
And these were themes that sort of occurred to us after the fact. So we came up with our 10. It's like, what is it that's sort of collectivizing these things? And, obviously you can project these ideas onto films. But yeah, really, really looking forward to getting through the 5 to 1 now. Just before we get into that though, Neil, are there any honourable mentions or films you were desperate to get on, but you couldn't quite get onto the 10? Your honourable mentions?
Yeah, so my list is stuff I have seen this year that was released this year.
Yeah, same.
And as in like theatrically released this year.
Yeah,
so there are 2 films that I saw in 2023. Is that right? Yeah, we're still in 2024.
right.
That I saw as part of the LFF coverage that we did in 2023 that were both released theatrically this year, but I haven't seen them again, so I haven't included them. I imagine that both of them would have been in the 10 had I seen them, and they are the Irish film by Pat Collins, That They May Face the Rising Sun, and the other is Wei Shijun's Chinese kind of mystery, sort of procedural noir, Only the River Flows, which I just thought was wonderful. And we did talk about that at length. We talked about both those films at length on the podcast, so I didn't feel bad missing them out. But yeah, and it was great to see them released this year because they're both fantastic. And I really, really wanted to get Pat Collins on the podcast to talk about his work and that They May Face the Rising Sun. So that's an episode I'd like to do at some point with him because I think he's a really interesting filmmaker. So those are the 2 that I wanted to sort of flag up as I think if I'd have seen them again, then they would have been on there. I just think they're fantastic. What about you? Have you got anything that didn't quite make it? I know of one because we just talked about it.
Yeah, the Radu Judah was definitely one there, but there was quite a lot. I mean, again, another one we talked about without sort of giving the whole game away from the first episode. But I really enjoyed Love Lies Bleeding, Hollywood Gate, which I think I mentioned to you. Which was this documentary about a guy who'd gone into Afghanistan with a film crew and had managed to get footage of the Taliban kind of assessing and then putting to use all of the equipment that the Americans had left behind. So it was kind of like eye-opening. I mean, it was subject to censorship, but you still could read between the lines, which was what's so beautiful about it. But it was also a kind of ironic anti-Top Gun in a way. So I enjoyed that. Dune 2, I really enjoyed. That was close to being on the top 10 because I think it was. I mean, again, I think Denis Villeneuve is probably my favorite sort of big budget filmmaker at the moment. And I think he's just done a great job updating. Well, not even. I mean, I think he does reference the films, but adapting that novel, which again has now been adapted for another time on TV. It's now a TV series, or one of the other books has anyway. Surprisingly, I really liked My Old Ass. Have you seen that?
No, I've seen that. No.
Yeah, it's really good. I think you'll really like that. That was like a surprising film for me. So it's a sort of take on Gen Z apathy through a kind of device of, it's not a body swap thing, but a younger character confronted by their older self. Yeah, so it's directed by Megan Park and stars Aubrey Plaza as the older version of the character Elliot, and the younger version is played very well by Maisie Stella. So it's really a sort of interesting take on the idea of you don't know what life is going to be like in sort of 20 years time, and how you're going to look back. And again, a lot of the films we've talked about are about memory in some way. Again, it seems to be a thematic of a lot of movies right now, and sort of it deals with that trauma and that sense of loss, and reckoning with your present self in only the way that cinema can, by visualizing somehow, or having a device that allows you to confront that past kind of representationally head on. So I really enjoyed that. I thought that was really sweet and well done. And the other one I think that really surprised me was Longlegs, which is the Oz Perkins horror. Again, not really something I would look to go see and sort of think, oh, I'd really love that. But I just thought it was a really, really interesting kind of skin crawling film with Nick Cage just being absolutely in his element, but also kind of made up in a way that you don't know it's him.
Yeah.
So it's just really, it really got to me in a way that horrors very rarely do.
Cool. I'll look forward to that. Yeah, and I look forward to My Old Ass as well. I love Aubrey Plaza. So
Yeah. No, she's great. She was the one redeeming feature of Megalopolis as well, which is definitely not on my top 10.
spoiler alert.
Yeah, it's gonna bang it in there. I've had a change of heart about Face, about the brilliance of Megalopolis. Not. Okay, so why don't you kick off this time? So what's your number 5?
My number 5 is Kneecap,
Aha, yes.
which is the story of the rap trio Kneecap, who are from the north of Ireland, and it's a really interesting kind of like mostly based on truth biopic of their formation, and in it the three members play themselves. So obviously I kind of love it because there's a kind of Hard Day's Night-esque approach to the characters and also the real people being played by the band members themselves. And in kind of music film terms, it really, really works because they're just great. And at no point do you think they're not actors, acting in the role. Like it kind of has that lovely realization throughout of like, oh no, this is who they are. There's a lot of it that's political, and sort of based on sort of stark economic and sort of political realities of the north of Ireland, in this century particularly, and how the kind of the legacy of the Troubles is not a kind of, it's not in an archive, it's lived, and still ongoing in a kind of like in many, many ways, particularly around language. So Kneecap are an Irish language rap group who played a role in the sort of the protection of the Irish language, and it's about language, and it's about the importance of language and place, and it's really, really funny. The music's fantastic. It's really well scripted and it's really tight. It's mostly kind of unfamiliar actors surrounding the three leads, but also one of the leads, dads, is played by Michael Fassbender, who is just
Superb. Yeah.
he's superb in this movie. I mean, he's always generally superb. And it's nice to see him back in stuff. And he plays a kind of Republican activist who is missing, presumed dead, but is not really. He's just a few bars away being a yoga teacher. which is hilarious. And again, he's this kind of interesting conduit to a kind of a past in Ireland that still has a resonance. But what I loved about it was how he gives himself to the film and he gives himself to his co-stars with such generosity. You know, he's clearly, in terms of like traditional professional acting, leagues above everyone else in this movie. It like just he's on a different. But at no point do you feel like he's wielding that. You know, he gives himself over to this performance and to this film so beautifully that it kind of elevates it. And I was thinking back to how he does that sort of routinely in films, and just, you know, it's quite rare, I think, for an actor. And it's funny because the other day I saw Gladiator 2, and everyone's talking about Denzel's performance, and I found Denzel's performance really selfish.
Okay, that's interesting.
Because I was like, and there's a hilarious scene where Tim McKinnon is trying to act with Denzel Washington, and he doesn't know what to do, and it's so obvious. There's obviously did it in one take because Ridley probably doesn't like more than one take. And Tim McKinnon does not know what to do with this performance, and no one else does. Like, he's in a different movie to everyone else, but also I was like, I don't think he knows what movie he's in. And it's an enjoyable performance, but it is at the detriment of everything, you know. And there's something thinking about Fassbender and Kneecap in terms of like the film doesn't work if he comes in and is Michael Fassbender. It just doesn't work. And not that Gladiator 2 has to work on that level, but how he can take that film and move it into a space that was unavailable to anybody else in that film through his, I think, is incredibly done. And you can just tell through his engagement with the film that there was a level of kind of professionalism, but also enjoyment that was possible because it's such a welcoming thing. And, you know, it was kind of thrilling having us talked about Hard Day's Night a lot this year with my book coming out, and people saying, oh, you know, where are these examples of kind of those kinds of films? And it's like they're not really around. We don't really have those kinds of musicians that can do that. Then to see this film and be like, oh, actually, this is a really great example of that. I loved how funny it was. I loved how bold it was. Unapologetic in terms of it's like these are the real people, and this was their life. And yeah, the DJ character, DJ Proval, who's older than the two rappers in the group, and the way he comes into the fold, and sort of how it impacts his life by being involved in this political group, is so fascinating. And his trajectory is kind of the emotional arc of the film, and it's really lovely. And I thought I loved it.
Yeah, I watched it as well and was really engaged by it. I thought it was really good. And I think it did that thing that we talked about a lot when we were talking about your book, which is the form and the content merged together. Yeah. You know, it's as chaotic in a way as the rap groups.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to say their music is chaotic because it's very well formed, but do you know what I mean? It's they've got chaotic lives, or they did have.
Yeah.
And it plays around with that. And then there's the political chaos of what's going on. And then there's the relationship chaos, you know, and there's just hilarious sex scenes, which was just,
they're amazing. Amazing, the sex scenes.
And yeah, like you say about, and Fassbender's just, it's funny because the other film that it reminded me a little bit of was Frank.
Yeah, same. Yeah.
And Fassbender obviously is kind of playing a different character, obviously, but a different type of character as well. But it was that sense of, in that film, there was a band that clearly wasn't a real band.
Yeah.
But they'd managed to make them convincing enough.
Yeah.
Whereas here, from the start, you were kind of like, oh, these guys are absolutely nailing this. And then, because I didn't know that they were a real group, my knowledge of contemporary music particularly is zero to slim. And yeah, I was just like, and then I realized, oh, they're actually a group. But then they've got that one song that is so, is so catchy. It actually grabs you. It works to grab you into the movie as well.
Yeah.
And like, and then all of the stuff as well, which is really funny because the stuff about the English, the police making them speak English, and it does relate to the idea of colonial authoritarianism, is about that denial of the self through language. And it's interesting, sort of, again, in a very different film, relates to the conversations we had at the second half of the film Dahomey, the Matty Diop film, about who am I if I don't speak my own language, and I don't. It's not just about being denied the opportunity to speak your own language, but it's like when that happens, the next generation, they almost kind of like have lost a sense of themselves, you know. And it's politically, it's about the fight to preserve that,
Yeah.
you know. So it's
I watched Dahomey the other day, and I thought the same
right.
thing. Yeah.
And and apart from all of that as well, it's just it's great fun. It's just great. It's just good fun, you know. And you can read into all of those things that we're talking about, or you can just say, "Oh, here are these guys trying to make it with their Irish rap," and like everybody's like, "What the fuck is Irish rap?" You know, it's just that's great.
Yeah, absolutely. Nicely put.
Yeah. Okay. So
So
number
what's your
5 for
5?
me. Yeah. So I have gone for number 5, La Chimera, the Alice Rohrwacher film with Josh O'Connor, among others. And yeah, I really like Alice Rohrwacher films. She's a singular voice. Again, we've talked about singular directors, and I think it's interesting because I think there's a sort of comparison to Jessica Hausner, who we talked to on the podcast this year, in terms of a female filmmaker from Europe who has got a way of a visual style, but also a vision. So, if you want to apply an auteurist moniker to, female filmmakers, Alice Rohrwacher is one, along with Hausner. Really loved Happy as Lazaro and The Wonders. And again, her films are completely unclassifiable. And it's one of those things where you think to yourself, in a different era, but in a different era, probably if the female filmmakers wouldn't have had the opportunity. But in this era now, it's like, where did these films are only going to be seen in certain circles? They're not going to get a wide release. But to be fair, La Chimera, I think, has done quite well, hasn't it? It's broken through quite a bit, which is great. And this is a film that kind of in the first 20 minutes, half an hour, you don't really know where this is going or what this is about. It's very abstract, and the early scenes are very opaque. So in a broad sense, it's about this British looter in the 80s. So this is Josh O'Connor's character, who's trying to steal artifacts from this ancient civilization of Etruria, I think it is. And like I say, it's set in the 80s, so it's got this beautiful sort of gauziness to it as well, in terms of the texture of the film. And it's interested in ideas around metaphysics, and in some ways the band of robbers who have found this particular cache of ancient civilization artifacts are kind of playing on the idea of superstition, and these artifacts represent something to people beyond the fact that they're ornaments, you know what I mean? So it's linked to a kind of idea of spirituality, and how these artifacts hold a resonance of the past. And I think the film, sort of in story terms, in mythical terms, is about the myth of Orpheus, who tries to rescue his bride from the underworld. It's a famous Greek myth, and that feeds into the story as well, because you find out that O'Connor's wife has been killed, or has she? She's just not there anymore, right? And his conscience, or his kind of longing for his wife, rubs up against his kind of very much man on the make, his shabbiness. He's a really sort of downtrodden, shabby, kind of grubby character in many ways, but with that sort of pretensions of a kind of higher knowledge. You know what I mean? He's smart in that sense. And it's really difficult to describe what goes on this film beyond sort of setting out that he then, that they find these artifacts, they're going to sell them, but he goes to visit the mother of his missing wife, and his conscience gets tripped by her maid, who's kind of asking, why are you doing this? What's going on? And then that feeds into later aspects of the story. And there's interesting sort of aesthetic moments, like particularly when Wacko films the characters kind of falling down, but they're falling up in the screen. She sort of reverses it, so people are upside down, and it's kind of like alluding to the idea of heaven and hell and this kind of thing. And it really sort of draws you into an understanding of a film that is dealing with themes that are beyond the simple material representation of what is going on, and it really pushes that towards the end. I'm not going to give anything away and try to interpret it either, but again, it's just a filmmaker working on such a very smart, nuanced level beyond realism, but not being overtly stylized in a way. It's it's unclassifiable, but it really grew on me, and by the end I was like, wow, that's earned something transcendent that other films that try to do it don't earn, let's say.
Beautifully put. I will share my thoughts at a later stage in this episode.
No problem. Okay.
Shall we?
So yeah. I mean, that's what we agreed that we were going to do. For listeners on this episode, that's what we've been doing when something comes up that we're going to talk about later on. But just to say, Rohrwacher, I think both of us think is right up there at the moment of filmmakers sort of working with a singular voice, and a uniqueness.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think Happy as Lazaro was probably my favorite film of 2019 when it came out. It's just absolutely singular filmmaker. Fabulous. So yeah, more to say on that in a little bit.
So your number 4, Neil.
My number 4 is Ryosuke Hamaguchi's Evil Does Not Exist.
Okay.
Which is, you just talked about an unclassifiable film, and I feel like this is also similarly unclassifiable. And his work is just, I find him so fascinating. Been rewatching some Elio Petri films, the Italian filmmaker. And what's really fascinating about him is how each film feels so different in terms of the formal approach to the narrative and the story. It's like Petri doesn't seem to come in and be like, well, this is me and this is how I'm going to do it. It's like, well, what does it need, and what's it trying to be, what's trying to come out in terms of like this idea, in terms of how it should be told. And I think back to Hamaguchi's films that I've seen, and they all kind of do that. And then this one does it arguably in the most radical way of his that I've seen, where there's a kind of dedication to dread, which is so low level. It's pretty much ambient. Like it's almost undetectable that there's something else going on at the level of like where it's headed. I mean, there's obviously the narrative, which is very straightforward and so banal.
Yeah.
It's like this company turns up in this small, tiny village where they want to put in a glamping, like a glamping site, and they have a sort of town meeting to sort of share their plans, and then the local community say, well, you can't put these things here because of the water supply, and it'll impact the water supply. And it's not like a kind of like 1970s or early 2000s kind of political thriller where it becomes about an investigation. It's just like they share it, and then they kind of go back to the city to kind of just think about it and work on it more. And like it's got this kind of bureaucratic edge to it, but it's so slow, and it's about this ostensibly this kind of character who sort of brings it up at the meeting in terms of like the water supply, who's got this really interesting sort of odd job lifestyle. And he's a parent, single parent. So it's kind of like part character study and also part kind of community study. But there's just something that kind of there's an unease to it, to the film, in terms of where is it going? How's this going to kind of erupt? Because you imagine it will erupt. And then it kind of erupts like a lot of the films on my list in terms of this almost kind of mythical magic realist finale, which doesn't feel out of keeping with what you've been led to expect, but it does. It's jarring. There's a kind of jarring turn in terms of the form, which is it's really ambiguous because you're just like I've felt this, but I've not been. I can't locate it anywhere. It's a real unease in the film, and then the film just sort of settles into the end, and it's just like, oh, okay, what was that all about? Like it's inscrutable, and I found it really really powerful for that. And again, part of that is the command of the filmmaking, which is just so assured in terms of the sensibility. That it's just it's a kind of strange experience. It's kind of like a museum experience or a gallery experience where you walk into an exhibition by an artist and you're like, okay, that's overwhelming, and I have no idea what I've just experienced. And you feel the craft and you feel the voice, but I'm just like, I don't know how I feel about this. And it's a film that I've thought about a lot, and a film I've listened to a lot as well. Because the last thing was that it's got my favorite score of the year, and there's something about the score in this film, which is I think where a lot of the dread and the unease sits. That is just it's just one of the most beautiful scores I've heard in recent years, and one of the only scores I've bought in recent years, and I love it because it is kind of beautiful and melancholy and sort of bucolic, but also, yeah, there's something under the surface that is this can't be contained, and the other thing is where Hamaguchi locates that in terms of the central relationship that kind of results in the ending is really really fascinating, and how he shifts the main character's relationship to the film is really 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 fascinating. So yeah, I thought it might be higher this year, but then again, there's still so much of it I haven't grasped or haven't reckoned with. So that's why it kind of sits where it does.
Yeah. I loved it. And it could have been on the top 10 easily. I mean, maybe just for me, it didn't quite hit the levels of Drive My Car, which was so high. And then the funny thing was, I mean, in 2021, which would have been 2022 for our reviews, Drive My Car was my number one, I think. But then I saw Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy and liked that better than Drive My Car. And I was like, oh, so he's going to be 1 and 2 then if I'd have seen it in time. And this didn't quite. Maybe I think the payoff is so good, it makes you reevaluate the rest of the movie then.
Yeah.
But I probably need to see it again, and maybe like in a year's time, it's like, oh god damn it, yeah, no, that was amazing. But because the first hour or so is so banal, you're like, what's he doing here?
Yeah.
When like Drive My Car kind of, I mean, it's not exactly ostentatious, but it announces itself as being good in a much more obvious way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where and like that central scene in Wheel of Fortune and Fantasy is just one of my favorite sort of sequences in a film in years. It's so good. But yeah, it's great. It's great, and like the payoff at the end. There's that moment that you're like, fuck, is that really? Am I actually watching that happening? You're like, oh my god, yeah, it's great. It definitely still of a piece with his level as again of being somebody who just continually makes great films. And I haven't seen, I don't know whether this is out yet, but he's not made another film this year called Gift.
So Gift is where I think the score particularly comes from. So it's an installation
Okay.
piece that kind of formed the part of the thinking or development of
Okay.
Does Not Exist.
Right.
It's kind of like it's an adjacent work, short work, and the composer's the same.
Right. Okay.
Ikibashi.
Yeah. No, I'm just reading here. Yeah. So it's actually the score is the important part, and this is the visuals to accompany the score. So that's interesting. So I wonder if that's going to be available at some point, or it's going to be released or anything like that. But yeah, I'll look out for that.
Your number 4.
4, yeah. So number 4, and this is a film that Neil talked about in his 10 to 6. So that's The Beast, and that's Bertrand Bonello, starring Léa Seydoux and George McKay. And Neil, you talked quite a bit about performance and that sort of sense of the presence of Léa Seydoux in this film, which is clearly I mean, she's in every scene, isn't she? It's one of those where it's kind of like watching her moving through these times and spaces and characters and sort of dressing in different ways is the coherent sort of glue of the movie. Um, but I mean, we did interview, and you did a great interview with Bonello on the film, which sort of explored some of the themes. But I think I really liked this because it's one of those films that's dealing with the future of technology and where it's going to lead us in a way that isn't sort of sci-fi speculation, which I like, a lot of sci-fi speculation, but this is much more about the implications for, human beingness or human psychology going forward. And what's funny is that I read the synopsis of this on Wikipedia, and it's just quite matter of factly straightforward about what the story is in a way that I think, I'm not sure I got that when I watched it. I mean, and then again, this is one of those films where I need to watch again to even sort of begin to wrap my head around. I saw it at the cinema. And I was like, that was great. I loved it because it was so opaque and requires you to work in a good way,
Yeah.
and not even interpret it. It's one of those things where, again, the experience of watching it in the cinema was just so overwhelming in many ways because it's got these big shifts in visual, um, in aesthetic form. So there's the sort of period piece in there, and then there's the let's say the contemporary world using phone cameras and surveillance cameras in the middle, and then there's got this hyper digitalized sort of future, which are all sort of spliced together in interesting ways. But on this synopsis, it says this is a world in which AI has redefined human roles, and human beings now have to go through the process of emotional purification so that they can get employment in the future. And I was kind of like, is that what it was about? Because I thought it was much less obvious or much less grounded in a specific synopsis like that. But I mean, again, I think it was related to some of the themes that we've talked about all of the films that we've looked at this year, which is about emotional traumas and the notion of memory and living our past lives. So Sadu goes back to France in 1910, and she's a she's a pianist and a doll factory owner at the same time, which is kind of interesting. Um, and then in this central section, so Sadu kind of goes back in time and then comes back to the future, where she's in these kind of really weird scenarios, sort of defining who she is or asking those questions within what looks like a kind of futuristic organization again, but it's difficult to really know what's going on in that sense. But there's that central scene as well where she's a kind of aspiring model and an actress who comes up again in each of these scenarios. She meets George Mackay's character, who's kind of a lover in one sense, and particularly in the first, but it never seems to be get to that point, doesn't it? It's always kind of unrequited. And then in the second sequence, where it's in 2014, Mackay's at his best there because he's very much playing against type as a kind of embodiment of toxic masculinity, and shooting these videos to camera, which kind of is reminiscent of the Radu Judah film,
For
as well as that moment there. And you get into this thing of what is real and what is synthetic, and I think as well it taps into that idea of we're watching images all the time that are firing at us at from different angles at different points in different contexts, and we completely lose our orientation to the world. I think part of it is to do with that. And I just think it's kind of like it's an example of what you might call a think film. You have the think piece in journalism, and this is a film that's kind of like ideas led, that's beautifully produced. The scenarios, the time periods that it's representing are really watchable in that sense. But it's not, again, it kind of reflects that sense of non-coherence rather than incoherence. It's not allowing you to easily interpret or stitch things together where you can go, oh, that relates to that, and that relates to that.
Yeah.
Um, And yeah, I mean, it really sort of feeds into, I think, the zeitgeist of, modern disorientation about what is the self in this world of changing technology and changing environments.
Yeah. Yeah, nicely put. Um, and again, like there's so many points into this film as well. I didn't get the kind of like employment aspect of it. Certainly got that, there's this kind of invitation to, through technology, eradicate past selves, which is kind of what he's doing in 2014 with the, creating this kind of using technology to create a kind of idea of the self, which is connected to, but kind of ignores a lot of his own past and kind of what the world around him. I think it's really interesting. Yeah, I think it is. I like the idea of a think film, and I do talk about it more in the Patreon. Only 6 to 10. So if you do want to hear me talk about it,
Yes.
then head over there. Cool. I'm glad it's in yours as well, because it's such an interesting piece of work.
Sure. So
Right.
on to you for number 3.
Top 3. My number 3 is a film that Dario has already talked about in the other episode, which is the jazz documentary Soundtrack to a Coup d'Etat, which has Dario's description of it was wonderful, and yeah, I think it was timely in terms of the conversations we'd had about my book in terms of like music films, but it was kind of annoying as well. Like one of the films that I saw, well, like 3 have come out. One I haven't seen because it's the Brian Eno film. One's out next year, which we covered on the LFF, which is Alex Ross Perry's Pavements film. And this, where I'm like, I was kind of searching for more examples of like how to approach a music film cinematically, and there's 3 this year that have kind of absolutely kind of nailed it. And I've got many in the book, but I was like, these are kind of higher profile and very different kinds of examples.
I had this vision of you watching this film and going, "You absolute bastard!" 5 stars.
That's it. That's exactly it. Volume 2. But yeah, it's at the level of, I mean, it's deeply pleasurable because the music is stunning. It's incredibly fascinating because of the depth of research into, the history of the CIA's operations in the Congo, the use of mercenaries through the Belgian government, who were the kind of colonial oppressors at the time. The level of research in terms of like the memoirs of the families of the jazz musicians who were sent to to act as kind of diplomats and ambassadors for America, and how that shift in their sort of understanding of their role was kind of sort of came to a real kind of crystallization through the kind of widespread violence in America in the 50s against Black people, which led to the kind of the civil rights movement of the 60s, and how music played a part in that. And this through line of music is really important because of how art and culture is weaponized to kind of nationalist ends a lot of the time. And interesting to, thinking about a film like Kneecap as well, how the role that music plays in the dissemination of cultural ideas, and how political jazz was, even though it was non-verbal. Music was really interesting. It's just, and it's so beautifully constructed at the level of form.
Yeah.
And one of those things where, there's a lot of feeling like this is a jazz thing, and it's like, but is it, or is it just got jazz music on top? You can't just put jazz on top and say it's a jazz thing. Like jazz has its own, as you said, syncopation as one of the ideas of it. And this film takes a lot of ideas from the music and deploys them, and in a way that kind of really helps you understand the intricacies of all these different connections, and how they kind of move in and out of each other, and how fluid they are, and how they're all kind of gathered around a central motif of American colonialism. Even though this stuff is happening abroad, and Belgium are involved, and Russia are involved, and it's kind of masterfully done. Absolutely loved it. And is, again, I think something that I imagine on the big screen has a power to it in terms of the archive material, but also a real pleasure to it in terms of the music itself is so great. So yeah, it was a good year. It was a good year for music film, and this would definitely be my, of the ones that were released that I saw, that definitely the kind of the high point of it.
Great. Yeah, and you can listen to my thoughts on soundtrack to the Coup d'etat because I had it at on my list at number 6. So head over to Patreon for that. Okay, I'm at number 3.
Yeah.
So this is a film that I had the most difficulty placing. It was kind of at 10, and then it was at 1,
Wow.
and then it was kind of in the middle, and I settled on 3, and that's The Substance by Coralie Farjat. And I think this is maybe the most interesting one to discuss because I know that you don't like. Well, I don't think you hate it, but you don't think it's all that. And I understand that actually it's flawed. I think this is a flawed film. But again, with my theme of the experience of watching it in the cinema, it's the cinematic experience that stayed with me more than any other film as being in the auditorium. I felt sick. I laughed. I was aroused. I was sickened. I was like bombarded. My heart was racing like mad. It just assaulted me on every level. And it's not just the ending, because people have talked a lot about the ending, where it goes into sort of body shock territory. And, we talked about it in linking it to Society, that film, because it's a similar sort of throwing everything at the screen, literally in terms of sick and, and body parts and all sorts of stuff. But I think it does work on the level of surface, because I think it's a film that's about surfaces, and it's not superficially. I mean, the superficiality is intentional, is what I think. And I think that, like the conversation we've had, and I spoke to Mary about it, so you can listen to our interview with Mary. I've spoken a lot about the film. So I'd rather talk about, to me and you, about, your misgivings maybe a little bit more. Because if I'm reading it right, it's the thing that you question about it is the use of references to other films, and it's all over references to other films. But I think that is an intentional use of surface level language, rather than a director that kind of doesn't know what she wants to do. So I'm just going to borrow stuff willy nilly. Do you know what I mean? And what's interesting is I read on the website Cinephilia and Beyond. This popped up on my Blue Sky feed. There was an article about Heat, and I don't know if you know that website, but they do these massive archival drops of I mean, this usually starts with an essay about the film, and then there's the script, and then there's other archival materials you can get. And one of the things that was on there was all the ways in which Michael Mann had borrowed from, different forms of art in his compositions of the film. And it just struck me again that film is a medium in which everybody is borrowing. And you could say that art, always everybody's borrowing all the time. And I think I agree to the level that it's up to the filmmaker to kind of borrow in a way then that creates or shapes one's own personal vision. But I think that there is a sort of an appreciation and knowledge of film, and a use of it that's interesting in terms of the themes of the movie and what the movie is trying to get at. So that's one element. But then also I think it is really interesting and problematic and contradictory in a way that I think it sparks my curiosity and my attention. And when I spoke to Mary, one of the things we sort of talked about was that idea of, that where does this sit in the relationship between different forms of feminism, which I think is a really interesting question, because it's kind of like, it's okay on the one hand, sort of making a film about Demi Moore who's losing her looks, but it's still Demi Moore. You know what I mean? And it's almost kind of like where does the film sit in? Is it sort of saying that we should feel sorry, of Demi Moore should feel like a victim, when up until this point, because she's Demi Moore, she's been able to take advantage of looking like that. So is it? But I think that the film is open enough and smart enough to not be making those kinds of not being didactic in saying this is what I think in those political terms. Again, it's open to interpretation in that sense. And like I said, just it's one of those films that's just stayed with me. Bearing in mind, I don't think it's a perfect piece of work, but there's a lot in it that I really appreciated, and it really assaulted me in a in a physical way.
Yeah. Interesting. As time's gone on, I've liked it less and less.
Okay.
And it's kind of like, it's interesting, like, because I think some of the films a lot of the films that you've said that you've seen, like off mic, I haven't seen either. Like, so films I know, like Anora and Conclave, there's something else as well, I think, where it's like the consensus that I've read and heard about is like, these are, I've had very little dissenting. And then you've been like, don't see what the fuss is about, kind of thing. As in, like, good, not terrible, not like, but just like what do people see in it? And I've really struggled. I've really wanted to see what people have seen in it, and then because it was an enjoyable cinematic experience, it was. I think it's quite funny in parts, and it was interesting watching it, thinking like, I am largely desensitized to these kinds of films when they're presented in this way, like the horror of it. I just didn't, and I think that's partly why I didn't like it. Was I was like, I've seen this film, I've seen this, and I don't know why you're repurposing it without critique or without comment or without, you're just sort of saying, in a way that we criticize a lot of male filmmakers for doing, including some of the filmmakers that she references. But I just don't see it in the film in terms of like, Society, The Elephant Man, Carrie, loads of Kubrick, and I'm like, but what are you doing with this? That's not just showing these sequences again. And that was I was looking for it, I was actively looking for it in the film. And then I don't know what she's trying to say that hasn't been said 1,000 times before. And using these images to do that, I was like, I don't know what you're trying to achieve here. And that's not a criticism in terms of like, but there's that sense of the discourse that it is saying all this really profound stuff about objectification of women and, women aging and, the pressure on women. And I was like, yeah, it's in there, but the film doesn't do anything with it. It just replays that. It's another example of women, attacking each other, even from inside and outside, and men being shits to them and throwing them aside when they don't look a certain way. It's like, there's no critique in it for me. There's no directorial point of view, because so much of it is lifted without. And I completely agree with what you're saying in terms of cinema. One of my favorite filmmakers is Jarmusch. That's his open thing, is like, steal everything. But when I watch a Jarmusch film, I'm like, oh, actually, you're taking something you've seen in a Seijun Suzuki film and you put it in this kind of, road movie set in the South. You put it in Down by Law. You've put something you found over here and you moved it over here. And that's a shift of context. And it was interesting in Sight and Sound where Catherine Wheatley interviewed her and asked her that question. And this is where a lot of it comes from as well. I'm like, yeah, this was my take, where Catherine Wheatley said, like, you've taken all these male filmmakers, Polanski, Kubrick, De Palma, really problematic filmmakers, either at the level of personhood or filmmaking, and you've shared these images again. What was the purpose of that? What are you trying to say? And Forager's like, I just like them. I think they're good movies. That's the movies I grew up on. And I'm like, yeah, that's the level of we're talking about here. We're talking about someone who doesn't understand that by putting all of these images in a row, you're creating a context. And the context is, you're rehashing from a feminist perspective. You're putting those women in your film through the same thing that the women in those other films were put in, either in real life or in those films, without any engagement with it from your own perspective in terms of like making us think differently about it. You know, everything we think about these images comes from the pleasure of watching them originally or understanding later discussions around, you know, our reframing of it. And the ending for me is one of those films that recalls so many films that I'm like, you know, like Society is a great example, right? Society earns its ending by creating a level of discomfort and new context, which it wasn't really there before, you know, and arguably was not understood at the time. It's only a film that's really become seen as a kind of, as a satire. And we talked about this when we talked about satire as well. Like that is a satire on the rich and how the rich eat themselves and the rest of the planet. And I'm kind of willing it into being in the substance, because I think that there is stuff there. And what was really interesting as well was like how it, and this is in the first half, my favorite bit is the first sort of sequences where it puts Demi Moore's character through this very, you know, sort of humiliating experience, you know, where it's all about like, you don't look this way anymore, so get rid. And it makes us as an audience feel like complicit with watching and viewing. And it's like, and then she introduces Margaret Qualley's character, and there is such an eroticism and a sort of and a sensuality to how she shoots that. And I'm like, oh, so now you're and I think this is directed at men, which I really liked. It's saying, well, this is what you want, isn't it? This is what you like. I'm going to give you what you want, knowing that a man has done, you know, has done this kind of thing to her, to Demi Moore's character, you know. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is a really interesting position to be in as a viewer, particularly as a male viewer. And it felt like here is the film coming into its own and saying, this is going to be a really uncomfortable experience for you as a male viewer, because I'm going to make you sit with the fact that you are turned on by this character, but not by this one necessarily. But it's still Demi Moore, so it's still, there's still a, and her context is. But then the film just it never paid that off. It then reverted back to being this very traditional sort of, you know, battle of these two characters. It was superficial for me, but I never felt like that was the point. I felt like there was nothing else that the filmmaker could do with that. And it's interesting that the short, I've seen the short, which is on Mubi, which is kind of that the original idea for this, and it's like it really works because it's a great concept, you know. And I like the bit the most where it was almost like Spike Jonze, where she goes to the Kaufman-esque bit, which I think is an aside, you know, where Demi Moore goes to this post office box essentially to pick up the substance, and that where it is, and like the white room in this kind of derelict sort of landscape. I loved all that. So like, oh, actually, this feels like I haven't quite seen this aspect of it, this idea before. So, and the other thing that really annoyed me was Dennis Quaid. And I was like, this is a terrible performance. And there's nothing in this performance, in his entire filmography, that suggests he can do this. Like, why is he cast in this role? Like, he fails in this role. Like, he is bad. And the point of the character is completely lost by a performance that does not know how to deliver this. And then that's the reason I saw in an episode, the other episode where I talk about Love Lies Bleeding, which I think is like number sort of 7. I talk about Ed Harris, you know. And Ed Harris's role in that is kind of similar in terms of like the position in the narrative and his impact on the lives of these women in that film. And he is awful in that movie, as in like he's an awful human being, and he plays it with such depth and glee. And it made me think like that's the kind of performance you need in the substance for this Dennis Quaid character to work. He's ridiculous. And he's just bad. Like his line delivery is bad. The way he does everything, the way you kind of...
You don't think that's intentional, though? You don't think that he's supposed to be bad? He's supposed to be really bad.
I think he's supposed to be a bad human being.
No, but you don't think he's supposed to be bad, like a complete over the... It's like everything else in the film is completely over the... It's like think of a TV executive as the most worst, like over the top stereotype of a TV executive.
But I think you can do that at a level of kind of having an understanding of the kind of performance that you need to give. I don't think he's a good enough actor.
Right.
And I think that's the thing. I think like I can see I can see where it's going. But again, at the level of directorial choice, I think, did you make this choice or was this cast for you? I don't know why you made this choice, because it's not, for me, it was not working. And it's like, you know, the first second you see that character, you know that character. And then I'm like, all of the possibilities of it being over the top and satirical are lost, because I'm just like, whoa, it's uncomfortable then, because I just think I think he's miscast. And it's making me think of, because it's making me think of other films, I'm thinking like, where in the Dennis Quaid filmography? And I don't even think it's a comment on Dennis Quaid's past as this kind of, you know, iconic golden age, late 90s, early 2000s kind of rugged. It's not even that, because you cast him in that role to look back on his own career, but he can't step into that role as the all-American, because the character is not an all-American good guy, you know, which is what Dennis Quaid is. And he's only ever been that. There's nothing, I was thinking about all of the films, and I looked on IMDb, like, where have you located this? And I think it's basically they've had to give him the role. That's the only thing I could think of.
Interesting. Well, I mean, I don't agree with that. I mean, because I don't think that like placing this role in his filmography is kind of pertinent to what the film is doing with him. To me,
But what I mean by that is like, but it makes me ask that question because it's not a good performance. Like, if it's a good performance, I'm like, wow, how did you think that Dennis
but
Quaid
I
pulled
think
this off?
for it to be a good performance, it would have to be a different character. You know what I mean? So I mean, all I can envisage is, like you're saying, if he's like, well, we can get Dennis Quaid, let's do it, or whether she thinks, there's something in Dennis. I think that, like, particularly at the beginning where he's in incredible close up, there's something about the shape of his face that sticks out to the camera. You know, when you're eating and stuff like that, and it really feeds into that kind of experience of the disgustingness of everything, you know what I mean? Which I think is sort of part of the aesthetic of the film. And I think that
But it's the aesthetic of another film. It's the obvious choice. It's not there's that choice of showing a grotesque man eating in close up has been that's the shot. So it's not, it's repurposing. It's just giving it you again. I'm like, I've seen this shot. I've not seen Dennis Quaid do it, but I'm also
yeah,
be anyway.
yeah, I mean, but again, it's like the I mean, we can go around the houses in this forever in terms of what you've seen elsewhere and whether it works for you in this context, or for me, or for whoever in a specific, you know, context when something has been repurposed. Now, you know, there's a lot of the elements of what you're saying that I can't really disagree with, but I think that for me, I mean, again, it's kind of like the reversal of the argument we have about Clueless. If we go back to that I can't see what you're seeing in that. That is just vacuous. It's not about vacuousness. It's not satirical because people like it in an earnest way. You know what I mean? So it kind of, I think that we're coming at the film from the opposite, like, standpoint, because we see something in the film that actually, just on its own terms, we enjoy and we appreciate. And I think that maybe it's the film that bypassed my set, because it worked for me on that kind of, like, in the moment, I'm like feeling feelings in the cinema because of what I'm seeing on screen. And I'm like, oh God, that's terrible. Oh wow, that's unbelievable. And it's making me kind of engage with, like you say, what is my point of view here as a male viewer when Margaret Qualley comes on. And then when you discover as well that, like, or you can see as well that she's certain points there's being a body double being used. And again, you could ask, is that intentional? Actually, here is Margaret Qualley, who is very, you know, obviously attractive in and of herself, but even she's not attractive enough in her body to be objectified to the absolute nth degree. So I think it's kind of like a satire that's trying to push to the absolute point of ridiculousness, and that's where I think that you know, Quaid sits in, and whether, you know, I think it's difficult for me to sort of say, to argue against, well, this is a bad performance. I think the question then becomes, is Dennis Quaid being bad on purpose? Do you know what I mean? And he's just being bad because it fit it, you know. And what does bad mean in that sense? Is like not in a realist context, or who would play that role and make it work, and what does working mean for that that particular role. Because if it's just a stereotype of a TV executive who's a disgusting, you know, one note, one dimensional male guy, then anybody could really have played it. You know, there's numerous actors who could kind of done that, because it is kind of one note in that sense. But the question then becomes is that the point? This is the one noteness of this particular character. So, and again, you can take that or leave that. That's, you know, that either works or it doesn't for you, I suppose, on an individual level. But I totally get where you come from, and I don't think the film is perfect in any sense. But I think for me, there are things in it that I think are interesting, and they're not simplistic in the way that the aesthetic and the theme, the form and the context are kind of brought together. And it is an interesting question, I think, in terms of what do filmmakers do with the stuff that they essentially nick from other people, and you know, that's always an interesting question that we've had with loads of filmmakers over the years, you know.
Oh, for sure.
You know, and like, you know, I think like even people like like Scorsese, I think, has often used stuff from other filmmakers because he likes the way it looks. You know what I mean? And that it doesn't really go beyond that. You know?
No, but it's generally a shift of there's a shift of genre, there's a shift of context, there's an engagement with the image as not as a benign thing. And that's what I kind of felt was lacking here, was like,
Sure.
these are potent images that you're lifting from film history.
Yeah.
You know, and I was
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's entirely, and I what's interesting is, like, similar to you, I think, in terms of other films, like, I know that I'm in the minority on this. You know, I've read one dissenting piece on The Substance, which was in Sight and Sound.
Okay.
And it's the only thing I've read where people are not like, this is, you know. So
I've seen a few people slagging it off online, but I know obviously you're not seeing that
stuff online.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's not engaging with the film on the terms that I want, which is really what you're doing, which is reckoning with it. And most of that kind of doesn't mention this stuff. So I think my passion for mentioning it in this way at this length is like, I don't have a forum otherwise to have done it, and I just don't hear these questions being asked about it. You know, I'm not saying that I'm right. You know, I'm just saying my experience of watching it in a cinema raised all this stuff, and then I went to look for engagement on it, and it's like, it's not really, and it's just, I'm like,
I mean, I think there is something to be said for that idea that as men, we can't ever really understand being in a situation where your looks is everything that is taken about you. You know what I mean? I think that there is a sort of gender politics there that I've read women critics sort of talking about the film and what the film does. There's a sort of sense of the horror and the alienation of that, and the desperation of this character wanting to hold on to that, and why the conceit of the story works in that sense, and then the horror is a kind of, the ending is a kind of outcome of the expression of all of that trauma in its most visceral, over the top kind of way. So,
I get that, and I think I was hoping that it would take all those images made by men and make you feel that level of discomfort, which is in the start of the film, which is, you are complicit in this as male viewers. Sit with it, and sit with this history of images created by men, which objectify and horrify and sort of abuse women. And I felt like that's what kind of she steps back from, and that's what's missing from the rest of the film. So I can see the intention, you know. But again, like, I was invited in as a male viewer, and then I was let off the hook. You know. But I still enjoyed it. You know, like, I still enjoyed it. And in the moment, I was like, this is a thoroughly enjoyable movie. Yeah.
I mean, I didn't feel as probably the difference is I didn't feel as let off the hook because, like, in the middle part, particularly with the Quayle stuff, and like you say, the lingering gaze, I was like, if this was and that's the interesting thing. If this was a male viewer, a male director, you'd be like, Jesus, you know what I mean? But because it's a female viewer, then you have to you have to you have to assume then that there is a kind of political point to the overtness of this. But if I totally appreciate for you, it's kind of like, well, actually, it doesn't that presenting it is one thing, but then going somewhere with it is another thing. And I understand that, you know.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we're on to number 2 now.
My number 2 hopefully won't be as controversial.
No, I think the controversy is good.
It's nice. It's nice to talk about that film as well. Is Robot Dreams.
Okay.
Pablo Berger, his animated film, non-dialogue movie, non-dialogue driven movie about a lonely dog who buys a robot friend, and then they become best friends, and then he takes his robot friend to the beach on the last day of summer, and he loses all of his power. The robot loses all of his power, and he cannot take his robot friend home. He has to leave him awake but unable to move on the beach for the winter until, and he tries to get him back in that period, but he can't get him back until the beach opens again in the spring the following year. It is a delightful movie, and it's a story of friendship, and it's the story of moments, and it's a story about how people come in and out of your life, and how we attach so much value and meaning to these things being permanent, and how they never are, and how they shift and change. But also the beauty of kind of making friendship and loving friendships, which is so beautifully rendered in this film, which takes a kind of real and mythical New York of the 80s, engages with film history in such beautiful ways. And it's just a really, really beautiful movie. And this was the first film that I have actively asked my 8-year-old daughter Tessa to watch with me. And I hadn't seen it, but I'd read about it, and I thought, I think she's ready to watch this kind of movie, and I think she'll like it. And I've purposely not said you should watch this, or let's watch this together, because I've been kind of terrified that she would hate it, you know. And I never wanted to be that dad either, who was like, oh, you have to watch all the things I love. Like, I'm not interested in that. I hope we have these lovely shared experiences, and we have done over the years. But this was the first time I'd said, like, there's this film and I'd like to watch it with you. And we did. And then Miles, my 3-year-old, watched it with us as well. And Tessa absolutely loved it. And it was so joyful to watch it with her for the first time. And we just sat there on the sofa watching it. And just seeing her love it. And we talked about it afterwards, and it was so moving as a film. And I was like, this is a really beautiful film. And then talking about it with her, and then since, it's a film that both her and Miles like comes in and says Robot Dreams, and wants it put on the telly, which has just made it such a wonderful experience this year. And I've used it in teaching already. And again, it's a film that understands film history and film form and does really interesting things with it. And it kind of, it's just, I don't know if you've seen it, or if listeners have seen it, because it's an animation that ostensibly, is regarded as for kids, but it's not for kids. It's a really, really beautiful film, and it's a cineast's dream. Like, there's so many wonderful homages, particularly there's a particular Wizard of Oz sequence, which is just absolutely delightful, that then sort of merges into a Busby Berkeley homage, just effortlessly, and the way it kind of links all of this stuff in service of the story is beautifully done. And similar to the substance reminded me of The Artist, where I was like, I want to know the deeper level that you are engaging with these films on. You know, these are all the obvious examples. What's below that? You know, and there's something about Robot Dreams where there's so many references to kind of like New York No Wave and early hip hop and kind of classic film history. Where I was like, I feel the layers of the filmmaking and the filmmakers' kind of like memories and nostalgia and sort of interests, which go beyond the obvious choices, which I just absolutely loved. And just the ending is so moving and kind of unexpected. You know, we've seen the film end in this way, where and just the confidence to be like, no, this is what this story needs. Is really profound, I think. I think it's an absolutely wonderful movie.
Great. Well, I haven't seen that, so I will have to check that out. It's one of my one of my blind spots is animation.
Mine too, for sure.
To be honest, you know, it's an interesting one. Because recent years I have liked quite a few animations, but they never seem to make it on my top tens. I don't know why that is. It's just the case. But that sounds really great. That sounds really, really interesting. I mean, again, it's I guess it's the sort of young adult thing as well. I always feel. I mean, and I've never been a fan of like the Miyazaki stuff that much. You know, it's just not. Yeah. So I'm always kind of a little bit loath to like commit. You know what I mean in that sense. So, but that sounds great. That sounds really interesting. So I will definitely check that one out.
It's on Mubi. So
great. Yeah, I will look at that for sure. Okay, number 2 for me is The Zone of Interest. And that is obviously Jonathan Glazer's historical drama based on the 2014 novel by Martin Amis. So the story focuses on the life of the German Auschwitz commandant Rudolf Hoss, which is played by Christian Friedel, who was in, only made the connection just today, played Henrik von Kleist in Hausner's Amour Fou. So that's where, and that's the same actor as that. Yeah, it is. But then also the film Zone of Interest is starring one of the actors of the year, probably, or last couple of years, Sandra Hüller, as his wife Hedwig. And interestingly, I read the novel in preparation for the film coming out because I am something of a Martin Amis fan. And it's a very different novel to the film. So the novel has this very intricate relationship between Hoss and an affair he's having. So it's kind of like a story of that, where he's trying to keep this affair going while all of the stuff is going on with his wife, who, as in the film, doesn't want to leave this home. And they both, I mean, I think it's not spoiling it to say the setup is basically they live in this very idyllic family home just outside the concentration camp, Auschwitz, the concentration camp, which is the zone of interest, basically. Although it's never really sort of referred to directly in the film in the way it is in the novel. And again, this is a film that played to my senses in so many ways. And as you know, Neil, you know, I've a real interest in kind of sound and the relationship between sound and image in filmmaking. And the sound design for this is just incredible. Johnny Byrne is the guy who did it, was nominated for many awards. And there's a score by Mika Levy in there, but it was more or less almost all taken out in favor of this absolutely harrowing sound design. So you never get the camera going inside Auschwitz at all. So it's like a complete, I mean, I can imagine the Glazers kind of thought, how can I do this and it not be Schindler's List? You know, or any of the other films that are really sort of in your face in terms of what you see in terms of the horror of the concentration camps. But what you do get is this constant noise of screams and guards yelling and gunshots and machinery working and trucks going in and out. And apparently Burns spent over a year developing the soundscape from archives and witness testimonies and historical records, documenting the sounds. But there's also, particularly at the beginning, there's this idyllic moment of the family, the kids of the two protagonists, kind of bathing in the river, and this Aryan family with the birds tweeting and sort of all going for a swim, and as you cut. Well, it's not a cut, is it? As you follow the family in their house, which again is very idyllic, and they're in the garden, and literally you see the wall there up against the side of the house, and all the time you're getting this noise coming, and it's relying on your kind of, it's obviously relying on your knowledge and your understanding of other movies. And again, what's great about this is, we talk about referencing. This references other films about Auschwitz without ever referencing any films about Auschwitz. So it's playing on your own knowledge of what you've seen through movies of that again, the horror of what that represents, right? So the creation of this kind of abject feeling that you get builds up over the time, and it gets to the point where the film's not long, but you're like, I don't know if I can take this, because it's just so oppressive, constantly hitting you kind of sonorously. And you know, Friedel is great as Hoss, but he's very much kind of in that middle management role, the banality of evil, and he wants to progress his career. And you get that sense of that compartmentalization that it seems that these Nazi officers must have held, where it's kind of like they have absolutely no kind of sense of the people that they are killing and, exploit. I mean, that's a terrible, it's not even enough of a word, but the way that they're treating the Jewish the prisoners, they're not human beings to them. So it's possible for them to compartmentalize their the sense of what they're doing. And there's just an amazing moment where Sandra Huller is just kind of like the housewife, and like trying to organize the day for the kids and stuff like that. And it's is at one point she sort of says to the husband, to Hoss, because he's going to get transferred, and say, oh well, we're all going to move to a different place now. And she's like, but I love it here. It's wonderful. How are we going to move our kids to another place? Can't you go there and just do your job and then come back and visit? Because I don't want to leave. And it's just like, that there's that moment. And then similarly, there's another point where in the house, all of their maids are, all of their helpers are Jewish prisoners, right? And she never kind of outright sort of treats them badly. But there's just this moment where one of them makes a mistake or does something, and she's like eating her dinner, and she just says, like, while she's eating her dinner, you do realize that I can have your ashes spread over the field at any point without even looking at the person. And it's just this kind of like realization where you think that she doesn't really know what's going on, but she's fully aware of what's going on behind these walls. And that, in a really subtle moment, brings to home, it's like these people knew what they were doing. You know what I mean? There's no, that compartmentalization is deliberate, right? And it's just, it hits you in so many ways. But then the mother turns up, and the mother has to leave because she's again sort of, oh, how are the family getting on? Are you happy here? And all this kind of, and then in 2 or 3 scenes later, she's not there anymore, and the husband asks, well, where's the mother gone? Oh, she had to leave. And and you could tell the mother's kind of like, I can't take these noises that are going on, this knowledge of what's going on. And again, we've talked a lot about this. I'm writing this article at the moment, or putting it together, about the idea of the apocalypse that you don't see. And it's just the perfect example of that, this film at the moment. I think it's an amazing piece of work. And the ending does something that's really interesting as well, which brings it back to the present, which some people have kind of criticized, but others, I think it's an interesting way to end the movie. But yeah, just just fantastic. I think it's one of those films again that's going to be revisited quite a lot in the history of those kinds of representations of the concentration camps.
Great. Still haven't seen it, so I shall. And just what you're talking there made me think about the conversation around Nickel Boys, and how, because obviously there's the idea that you shouldn't use cinema to do this kind of storytelling.
Yeah.
But it's like, well, actually, what are the properties of cinema that make it possible to engage in different ways with these kinds of histories formally? So a reminder to watch it, which I shall. Maybe not over Christmas, but
maybe not. Leave it for a little bit. Yeah. Just before, so we're coming to our number ones now, right? And I'm just going to say something. We haven't told each other what our lists are.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling our number ones are the same film. I don't know that, but I have a feeling they are. And if they are, I'll just tell you straight away, and then we can talk. Cool. Does that work?
It does, but they're not.
Oh, you don't think so? Okay. No. All right.
So, yeah.
Go on, Liv.
Well, my number one is a film that you've already talked about.
Oh, okay, fine. Oh, well, forget it. You go ahead.
I
know which one it is.
Now I'm curious to know which one yours is. Mine is Alice Rohrwacher's La Chimera.
Okay. So I was wrong.
Now I'm like, what could his be?
Okay.
And have I? Is there a glaring omission in mine?
Well, there might be actually.
It might be. Okay. Yeah. So La Chimera is the film that I love this film so much. It surprised me in terms of Josh O'Connor. Like, I hadn't quite seen what people saw. I like him and stuff, but I was like, and this film kind of really, I was like, wow, he's amazing in this film. And what I loved about it was, I've talked a lot about this in the last couple of years in terms of films that are aware that they're films and engage with the fact that they're films and want you to be reminded throughout that they're films, and how this is a film which is about, myth and magic, and the place and power of that in our lives, and in the lives of the characters, and the communities and the histories of the place where they reside, but also that film is magic, and it kind of reminded me a lot of Wells's F for Fake, in terms of like, this is all a magic trick. This is all an illusion. And we should enjoy that, and we should revel in it, and we should be present with the possibility of the form at all times. So all that stuff you were saying about Orpheus and the kind of the way she rotates the camera to move, move the camera to literally rotate characters upside down. There's a revelry in the film form throughout, where it kind of stops and becomes these kinds of musical folk interludes, and then goes back into the narrative, and there's such playfulness, and it's like, yeah, this is magic, and this is something that should be enjoyed, and it opens the door to what she wants the film to be about, I think, which is about kind of magic and myth, and looks gorgeous, great performances, a lovely mixture of, Josh O'Connor doing kind of amazing work, Isabella Rossellini, and then these kind of local, amateur, non-professional sort of mix of local characters, and how you feel the time spent in the making of the film in the relationships that are on screen, which I just absolutely love. And yeah, just the romance of the character of this man who, as the film shows, cannot live anywhere. So when his partner dies, he gets the chance to live in this kind of mythical, idyllic, utopian space, which is not real. He can yearn and he can long for this. The reality is their relationship probably wasn't that great, but now that she's dead, gone, he can live out that life, and that's the only place he feels comfortable, because he does not feel comfortable in his own skin, let alone, the reality of, and how he kind of is drained by living out this. Is it real? Is it, in the film, his skill is a kind of diviner. He can divine where antiquities are under the earth, and he kind of when he does this, he gets this like divining rod stick, and then enters this kind of trance-like state. But there's something about it where you get the sense that he just knows where this stuff is. Like, he just innately knows, but he puts on this kind of performance.
Yeah.
Which builds his own persona. People have this kind of idea of him as this kind of character, and he's performing all the time, and he's kind of he buys into that that myth constantly. And then he meets a character which is that the maid, who really kind of makes him question.
Yeah.
Which
Doesn't buy the bullshit, does she? Really?
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
it.
She's like, this is just, you're just thieves.
Yeah.
And this is disrespectful to the dead, and
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
stuff like that. It's really brings all those audience questions into the fore, and he kind of he engages with all of it, but he does not go where you expect him to go with it at the end, which I love. Yeah, she's a brilliant filmmaker. She makes films under their own time. Like her idea of time is wonderful. Yeah, and there's just this. It's so enjoyable. It was so there's lots of great scenes. Well, with her sister playing this kind of arts antiquities dealer, which are really great. There's a mystery. There's lots of mystery elements to it. It kind of weaves in loads of stuff. Yeah, absolutely love that movie. That movie would be on my 10 in any 10 of the last year.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. As I said, really enjoyed it. A film that sort of grew on me. And yeah, we discussed Rawwacker as being one of our favorites. So yeah, we'll have to try and see about getting her on perhaps in the future. So my number one. Yeah, interestingly, I'm interested now what your reaction is going to be, because I'm surprised that this wasn't on your I wanted to get it in my top 10 but couldn't. And this is a film that's been on a lot of the top 50s but hasn't been in many top 10s. And that is Perfect Days, Wim Wenders movie.
Yeah.
So this is a drama set in Tokyo starring Koji Yakusho in just a pitch perfect performance as Hirayama, who is a public toilet cleaner in Tokyo. And he's absolutely dedicated and fastidious to the role of being a public toilet cleaner, which is part of leans into the thematic of the film in a real way, particularly because this is a repetitive task and one that's, demeaned in the movie, obviously. And, from the outside on, he's looking, it's like, really, a public toilet cleaner who's kind of happy with his job? What's that all about? But that's key to kind of understanding this film. But in his spare time, Hirayama has many cultural interests, including music, which he listens to on tape cassettes, particularly in the van that he drives around in. And this becomes key because it's also a way of him to engage with some of the other characters, particularly the younger characters who he works with, who it seems have kind of, if we're putting them in the context of Gen Z, have lost their sense of value, let's say. And this is where there is a sort of link, I think, to some of the themes that you'd see in Ozu in terms of that intergenerational discrepancy or misunderstanding, And again, I don't think it's like overtly didactic or political with an older person telling young people how to behave, but it's just kind of like a sense of, slow down and have a look around at the world, So music is one, and then he reads a lot. He gets one novel, reads William Faulkner, reads Patricia Highsmith, and has got this routine, lives in a very dilapidated, simple one-bedroom apartment. So he's got these, his social context and his job are very minimalist. But he's got this expansive cultural knowledge and interest and curiosity. He likes gardening and photographing trees, and seems to draw, I won't say happiness, but contentment from this cultural experience. And it's just a beautiful film about how someone manages a life by engaging in presence and loving this. I don't want to even call them simple pleasures, but the values of being focused on particular things that you're interested in and knowing that you love them and committing to them and gaining as much pleasure as you specifically can from that one example of, the book or the piece of music and the artifact of playing it and what it means to you and celebrating it with somebody else, right?
Mm.
But then in terms of the him going around Tokyo, it's a beautiful representation of, a Tokyo, and the public toilets are fascinating in and of themselves, because I think that they're designed in a very specific way, um, because you can see inside them when nobody's in them, but then when somebody goes in, then the glass becomes it becomes kind of opaque and white, so you can't see, you can't. But everybody knows they're a public toilet because you can see from the outside, so they have to be kept really clean, right? But this is part of a kind of gorgeous audio-visual tour of the city. It's absolutely beautifully shot, this film. And I think that that's almost a constant reminder of the beauty that's around you, that's right in front of you, and often that we just take for granted, especially living in a city and we have these routines. So it's trying to sort of remind you of, there is something fulfilling in the routine, and there is something fulfilling in the representation of the thing that you see every day, your path to work, or the sunset over the bridge that you cross every day.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that that there isn't trauma in this guy's life. His niece shows up, who's run away from his mother, so he obviously doesn't get on with his sister. He's kind of got this unrequited crush on a restaurant owner, and there's this beautiful scene where she sings a song, and it's one of his favorite songs, but she sort of does this rendition of it, which, brings him to tears. And then there's a moment at the end where that relationship, which you think in another movie again would be kind of fulfilled in some way, but it gets reversed or gets undercut by something that takes place, which I won't. I'll leave that to people who want to see the film. And this just hit me on a level, I think, in a personal way, because I'm reading a lot of Zen, particularly the work of Shumayo Mizuno. And it's a lot of the idea of Zen Buddhism is trying to not find happiness in these huge external motivations, or the things that you might find overtly entertaining, let's say, but just in the small things of life, taking pleasure in those things. And that idea of enlightenment comes from a life of committing to an excellence, even in the small tasks that you do over and over again. And I just think it's such a beautiful evocation of how to think about what it means to be living as a human being in that sense of you only have a finite amount of time and a quite a narrow bandwidth of what you can engage with.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the problems, and again, I'm looking at myself in this, is trying to find fulfillment in ever more cramming things into your life to find that thing that's going to fill that void.
Yeah.
And I think it's just a wonderful piece of work that manages to capture, some of the way in which you might be able to think, actually, less is the way forward in terms of getting through the day.
Yeah. Don't really want to add much to that. So beautifully put. Yes, it's not quite on my. It didn't make this 10. It makes my alternative 10. And part of the reason that is I love the film, but also loved watching it with you. That was really
Yep.
great. In your house in your flat in London. It reminded me of Patterson in the way that it's kind of like a non-Japanese filmmaker paying tribute to Ozu in many ways, but kind of bringing in their own taste. I love. I remember we watching it, thinking like, this is a lot of the stuff he listens to and reads feels like Vendors. Which I like. I don't mind that. It feels very obvious, the Patti Smith and the Faulkner and stuff like that, because Ben is and it kind of links back to his earlier work, particularly things like Paris, Texas, but before that, in terms of the road movies, in terms of like Alice in the Cities, like it's not hiding any of that, which is lovely, and means that it doesn't feel like it's a kind of inappropriate going in and trying to do Ozu in Japan kind of thing. It creates this really nice relationship between that stuff. But yeah, it's a really beautiful film. You illustrated why in many ways so lovely, but I just wanted to sort of add that note. But feels like a good place to end, because it's such a lovely film and such a lovely set of thoughts to end on, really.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I should have mentioned this up top, but I had it written down at the bottom of my notes, which was like, yeah, we saw this together, and it was kind of interesting because I think that, we were discussing at times that the ability to watch stuff together, which is not available to us very much anymore.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it was funny that the Patterson link, obviously we talked about that came up. And it's films like this again that I think, I mean, when we were both living in Cornwall, it was often quite difficult down there as well, because as you can't get to see stuff. Yeah. So there's always a sort of kind of barrier to that. But then I think at times, though, it's nice where you don't have that opportunity, and then you do get the chance to see something or do something. Like we went to the concert, the Squirrel concert, and then, various other things that we've done, which are just kind of like moments in time, which again, maybe give them a little bit more weight than they would if you took them for granted. Just going to see, say, for example, exactly. Instead of, like, it would be sort of pointless, me and you going to see Gladiator 2 together in a way, wouldn't it? You know what I mean? Because it's kind of like, so I think sort of picking those particular types of films to see with you or see, with whoever, you know what I mean? I think that's a process of curation, I think, that people don't talk about enough.
Yeah.
Talk about curation in terms of what to see. But I think seeing certain things with certain people, like with The Substance, sort of talking to Mary immediately afterwards, because I knew she would love that film and she would give that kind of take. And then to have your take on it is a very different take. So I think sort of curation of experiences is something that this film made me sort of think about as well.
Lovely. Yeah. Oh, nice. What a nice place to end.
Cool. Well, really enjoyed that. We went on, I think The Substance just kind of like derailed us into a bit of positive confrontation, let's say.
Absolutely.
But that was good. That was good. So there's a bit extra time for the main show, but that's great. It's the end of year, obviously, and thanks so much to those of you who've stuck with us and listened to the main show. Like I say, if you've got the inclination to support us, then head over to the Patreon. We've done a lot more extra stuff this year on there, and obviously you can listen to the 10 to 6 of this episode. Neil, great working with you this year as always.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. Good to have you back. It's been a really fun season. Some great work. Some great chats. And I love this episode. Yeah, this was really cool.
Lovely.
So thank you to our listeners and our Patreon subscribers. Thanks to everyone who's come on the podcast this season. Thanks to places that have hosted episodes and all that kind of stuff. We really appreciate all of the support and engagement that we get. And hopefully this finds you well over the festive period, getting some rest ahead of what will doubtless be another chaotic and crazy year, because they all are. And we'll be back with a new season towards the end of January or beginning of February. We haven't quite worked out when or what yet, but we are working on it, and we'll be back. And we're already looking forward to it, but we are going to take a little bit of a breather. So we'll see you on the other side. But for now, this has been the Cinematologists podcast. Thanks for listening.